Hey guys, welcome back to the GT350 garage. My name's Walter and I want to show you guys kind of the progress I'm making on the cylinder heads for my engine. This is a pretty big undertaking and I put a lot of planning into the modifications on these cylinder heads. Basically, because I'm building a high compression engine, I need a small combustion chamber, right? In order to do that, I have to mill the heads to reduce the combustion chamber CCs. So that lowers the intake port closer to the head gasket relatively, right? Well, what I've done is to combat that, I've raised the floor of the intake port and I've raised the roof of the intake port. The end result is basically I have a raised intake port trick flow twisted wedge head. And then on the exhaust side of the head, I've done some fairly extensive porting already. I want to show you what one of these heads looks like before I get started, and then I'll show you some of the measuring that I did to line up the intake ports, kind of a little bit of what I did with epoxying the ports, and then some of the work that I've done to actually start cutting the ports and getting them to shape. On these two heads, this closest one to me is currently untouched. I haven't ported it yet, it's just marked. And the one in the back, I've done some of the heavy cutting on it. I'm about 12, maybe 14 hours into that cylinder head, and I'll have about 60 hours in porting these heads when it's all said and done. So this is not a DIY hit it with a sanding roll kind of affair. This is legitimate porting. I've done quite a bit of port work over the years. I've studied airflow, I've studied cylinder heads, and so all of the modifications that I'm making to the cylinder heads, they're all based on good porting principles, and once they're done, these will go to my machinist for valve jobs and new guides. Once that's done, we'll actually throw them on the flow bench and get some flow numbers on them. So let's take a look at the difference between these two cylinder heads, and to do that, I'm gonna grab the camera and I'm gonna show you actual up close in detail what I've got going on. Oh, this is the TFS Twisted Wedge heads that I'm using. I picked this setup used. They were in really rough shape. These things sat in water, and so the corrosion on them was extensive. This head was the better of the two, and I've had to do a ton of work to clean these things up just to get past the corrosion on them. But let's start with what we're talking about here on the exhaust side, and we're going to start with, here's our end exhaust ports, and you can see that the floor of the port is above the gasket opening. Now, typically I won't lower this floor, but we're talking about a 1/16 of an inch here. This is a very small margin, and for the sake of consistency, I may actually open this up to the bottom, because when we get to this port, it's at the bottom. There is no material right there above the bottom of the gasket. It's pretty much done. Same thing for this one. You can see that we're right down to the gasket, and here we're a little bit above. So I may revise the floor of these ports just a smidge, although that is not normally what I would do when I port a set of these. The roof of the port, you can see, is closer to the gasket on these end ones than it is on the middle ones. And yes, I've checked versus my machined edge here, and we are the same exact height from this edge down to the top of the port. So there's just a casting difference in this cylinder head, and I'm gonna fix that the best I can. Now, there's a lot of debate over what's a good cylinder head these days. These are old. These are probably at least a 20-year-old set of Twisted Wedge heads. Based off of this number, I would put these heads built somewhere around 1995 to 1998. That's how old I think this particular set is. I'm going to turn on a light, and you can kind of get an idea of just how far you can almost see the entire seat. These things have an incredible short side radius, and TFS did a wonderful job on these. The very first set of these that I ever ran, the first thing I noticed was the exhaust note of the car. So it sounded entirely different than any other set of cylinder heads I'd run up to that point. And ultimately, they sound different than any other set of cylinder heads I've run otherwise. They sound different from an AFR. They sound different than an Edelbrock. Twisted Wedge heads have their own unique sound. Now, in this port, let me get my pointer in here. In this port right here, we have a thermactor passage right here past the guide. These are an emissions legal head, and I'm going to port the snot out of them. So we're going to get into that thermactor port, and I'll show you here in a minute. All right. So let's talk about the intake side of these heads. You can see that I've already epoxied these. And I put way more epoxy in them than I needed. We've got almost half an inch of epoxy here on the floor. But I wanted to make sure I had enough to work with. If you look at the top, I'm actually going to this upper line, not the lower line. And this upper line, this raises the roof of the intake port about 0.45 inches. And this lower line right here, we're raising the port about 0.2 inches. Keep in mind, we're cutting a bunch of material off the face of this head. So we wouldn't have had enough material for a really proper gasket seal here otherwise. And getting the intake manifold to port match to these heads with the intake manifold or the intake ports way down low on the valley is just a pain in the butt. So rather than try and move the intake port down in the intake, machine the intake to sink the manifold down in, I've raised the port, and then I'll port match the intake manifold to match the cylinder head. Now, give you an idea, I'm going to plunge the top of the port here on the valve cover side. And I want you to see how much material there is to work with on a Twisted Wedge head. It is substantial, and in a good way. So here's just a quick plunge measurement, and we're at about 0.6 of an inch, a little over 0.6 of an inch. Okay, for reference, look where that puts us off of the same plane on the valve cover gasket rail. We've still got 1/8 of an inch, more than 1/8 of an inch, in fact, to work with to the top of that port. So am I worried about going through the top? Not at all. There's a lot of material in this cylinder head to work with. TFS was very generous with this casting, and it's one of the reasons I like this cylinder head so much, is there's just a lot to work with here. Now, let's flip this thing over and take a look at the combustion chambers. All right, so you can see the water damage to this head, and I've cleaned this head up. I've hit this with a sanding block, and we've still got lots of pitting, right? These things, again, they sat in water. So I've cleaned up the seats. The seats are serviceable. I don't have to replace the seats. But they need a lot of work. And I'm not going to run the 1006 Velcro lock wires because I'm not a big fan of those gaskets. They've never really worked out for me because I've always struggled to find guys that know how to properly machine these grooves. Unless they're done by the factory, everybody that tries to do them by hand seems to screw them up, in my experience. So I don't mess with them. Anyways, this chamber is a really, really good combustion chamber from an efficiency standpoint. Now, I'm milling these things. They're 61 cc's from the factory. I'm going to take them down to 48 cc's. And you can get away with that on this cylinder head because if we turn the head here a little bit and we look here, you can see that that valve seat is better than 1/8 of an inch. In fact, let's see. It's almost 150 thousandths. That valve seat's way up in there, okay? And I'm going to take these to the point that the valves are almost flush with the face. And that'll work out to actually unshroud the valve right in here, which, you know, that's always a good thing. Anytime you can unshroud any part of the valve, it's better for cylinder head flow. So we're going to unshroud on the short side, and this head has a nice short side radius. It rolls over nicely right there. You know, but I'll be able to lay back the combustion chamber, and then by removing some material in here on the face of the head, we unshroud sooner. So milling the heads is going to help a little bit with the flow. I'm flat milling them, not angle milling them. And you can kind of see the corrosion in that exhaust port, how bad it was. Same with this one, there's still carbon buildup in there. A lot of work to do. Never mind the blue overspray, that's just from the dye. I use an aerosol dye when I'm marking. I don't get too concerned about what the cylinder head looks like in this particular case because I'm going to paint these to match the engine. But anyway, so you get an idea where we're at on the combustion chamber side. These are nicely radiused here from TrickFlow. So this just gets a cleanup. And this radius right here, a lot of this is going to go away, and this area will get a little bit smaller in a different shape as a result of the milling. Because again, I'm going to take a good chunk off down to about there as part of the milling process to get these things down to 48 cc's. It's really going to tighten these chambers up, and that's not a bad thing. So let me show you the head in progress. All right, so here's the exhaust port in progress, and you can see that I'm up to the top of the gasket opening. And on this particular head, I have not lowered the floor of my port. Again, both of these cylinder heads, I've found that the center ports are much lower than the end ports. So I'll take a look at that. But if you look down in there, you've got a really great view of the valve seat on the exhaust side. This is a very good exhaust port. I'm really excited to see flow numbers on these when they're done. I have a sneaking suspicion we're going to be in the 225, 230 CFM range on the exhaust. Now, one of the reasons for that is because, as I mentioned, I'm not afraid of the thermactor port. Now, on this head, in this port, you can see the thermactor port is there, and that is a 5/16 port that I'm plugging with a piece of 5/16 aluminum rod. If we move to the other end of the cylinder head, you can see that that port is not consistently in the same place, and I've gone clear through into it. But that's okay. I'm not bothered by that. We're into it here as well. I've still got a lot of work to do on these heads, okay? You can see that I've been working on the bowls, and they're not pretty at the moment, but they will be when they're done. So now let's take a look at the intake ports on this head. Okay, so the roof of the port is where it should be, where I want it. The floor of the port, you can see how much work I've done and where the filler is. We've got a little over 1/8 of an inch of material here. It's actually, it's about 3/16 of an inch of material here. And it lays back in here really nicely. I've still got my work cut out for me. There's still a fair amount of work to do on this particular port. Let's see if we can get a better shot there. Okay, there you go. So you can kind of see down the roof of the port, and you have an idea that you can expect some air to move through this port. This is a big port now. I reckon these are going to probably CC at somewhere around 215 cc's when they're done. They're huge. Yes, the engine's 289. No, I'm not worried about port velocity. That's the least of my worries. I've run Boss 302 engines before, and port velocity is not the issue with those engines either. So I think we're going to be just fine here. I've still got a little bit of work to do behind the valve guide on that tapered section where it goes in above the seat. But so far, this is the direction these ports are coming, and you can see I've cut in most of the ports. I've still got a bunch of work to do on this one. And yeah, I'm like 12, actually I'm like 14, maybe 15 hours into these cylinder heads so far. And I've just got a ton of work to do. But I wanted to get a pretty close approximation on one port and then make everything match. So this is where I'm at so far. Let's take a look at the combustion chambers. So when I'm porting a combustion chamber like this, I've got a set of valves that are cut down, so they're very thin. But this gives you an idea how quickly this chamber unshrouds, and it's one of the reasons I like these heads so much. The exhaust face of the head, that valve unshrouds very quickly. Now, granted, you know, this is the equivalent of about 800 lift, but you've got 3/8 of an inch between the edge of the valve and the combustion chamber. And some of you guys might be cylinder head guys and say, well, why don't you put a bigger valve in there? Why are you running a 202 and not a 205 or a 208? And yes, there's room for a 208, but just barely. And I don't see the need to add the weight of a 208 or a 205 and I don't want to tighten up this clearance. I'll be able to get basically the same amount of flow, because ultimately the throat is going to determine how much air is going to flow past there, right? It's only at really, really low lift down here where we would really see any benefit from the bigger valve. Once you get out of here, the bigger valve doesn't matter, okay? So the cam in this engine is going to be about 600 lift. There's about 600 lift right there. 208's not going to make any difference there. It's just not going to care. But if we come around here, you can see that this makes a nice radius right here. Okay, so we have a nice radius here. As soon as this thing comes up off the seat, we're unshrouded very quickly. And that's what I'm looking for. And that's one of the reasons, again, I really like these. Twisted wedge heads are just an incredibly good choice, especially if you want to put some effort into them. These things have so much potential laying around in the design. So that's the intake portion of the chamber. Let's pull that valve out of there. And you can kind of see that I still need to do some work right here behind the guide. But as far as up to the guide, I'm really happy with that. I'm fairly happy with the direction that the roof of the port's going. It's coming along really nicely. I'll measure the throats on these once I get a little bit closer. I haven't opened the throats up that much, but so this area right in here is about where I have the most work left to do on this particular port, and this port's almost done. And then this port will be the mirror for every other port. I'll make every port the same, and to the point that I'll CC them and make sure that they all CC within about a CC of each other to ensure that they're equal. Now this is the exhaust port that's done. And let's just turn that around so we get a little light in there. And you can see the transition is a nice transition. I do still have a little bit of work to do right in here, especially right here around the guide, but not a lot left to do to this port, although this one does have a little bit of room to go up right in here. It's not quite as high as a couple of the other ones that I've got, and I'll be plugging the thermactor passage so that I can actually port right into the thermactor passage right here, because it won't hurt a darn thing to open up into that passage, especially once it's got a solid aluminum rod run the entire length of the head. It'll basically just make that thermactor passage disappear. If I wanted to, I could weld the heads up and get fancy with them, but I probably won't. So anyhow, little insight into the porting on these twisted wedge heads for my build, and I'll do another video to follow up once these heads get a little bit further along and show you guys some more of what I'm doing. All right, so there's some insight into the work I'm doing on my cylinder heads, and I want to put this in context for you guys. I gave $300 for these cylinder heads when I bought them. The guy that had them, he was kind of like, I'd like to get more for them. Well, they were a $300 set of cylinder heads, okay? And I say that not because I want to devalue anybody's opinion of what they have, but when you get a set of aluminum cylinder heads that have sat and had water in them, and they've got crap growing in the intake and exhaust ports from the corrosion. That there's rust on the seats, and there's green corrosion growing in the guides. The valve springs are rusted, the retainers are rusted, the rocker arm studs are rusted, the guide plates are rusted. I mean, when you're basically buying a casting on the hopes that the seats are in good enough shape that you can still use them with a new set of guides pushed in and everything else replaced, it's kind of a long shot. And right now there seems to be, because of the difficulty getting new parts, there seems to be some idea that used parts are worth way more than they're worth. I'm seeing used parts go for stupid amounts of money. I mean, I just gave $600 for a Mexican 302 block that 2 years ago I wouldn't have given more than $200 for. But I needed it as a spare, so it's sitting behind me. The thing with these cylinder heads is, I know what the potential is of a TFS Twisted Wedge. I've used these heads extensively over the years. Out of the box, they're probably one of the greatest cylinder heads you can bolt on a 5-liter Mustang, okay? Just hands down, out of the box, these things kick ass, all right? They let you run a decent cam with a stock piston. They make killer power. You match them with a good intake manifold like a System X2 and some decent headers, and you can make with shorties. Well, in California, I was making 340, 345 horsepower to the wheels with these cylinder heads, an X-Cam, a System X2, shorties through cats, okay? Completely legitimately passing California emissions, maybe not by the numbers with the X303 cams, but as far as the tailpipe emissions were concerned, they flew through emissions. They didn't have any problem. It's just a really, really good cylinder head, and it has a lot of potential when it's ported. Back in the day, Total Engine Airflow used to CNC these things, and they get like 330 CFM out of the intake side of this head, and like 230s out of the exhaust side at like 600 lift. So we're talking about a very competent casting. What a lot of guys don't realize with these cylinder heads is how much material is in them. TFS is very generous with their castings. They put material for days in these things. There's, as I showed you in the video, there's just so much material above the intake port that raising the intake ports became the logical solution to my intake manifold fitment with the decked block and the severely cut cylinder heads. Why would I try and cut a manifold to wedge it down in further if I can just raise the intake ports and bolt on an intake manifold where all I've had to do is elongate the holes for the bolts? That's the logic that I'm using for building this engine. Porting these cylinder heads to get good numbers out of them, to move a lot of air with them, even on my small displacement build, is the right thing to do. And a lot of guys will argue you could put a bigger valve in them. Okay, you could, but why? What's the purpose? Bigger valve's heavier. Now you're talking, okay, well, let's put a 208 in it. All right, cool. Well, let's go to an 8mm stem, or let's go to a 7mm stem. Let's put an LS valve in it. Now you're changing different guides, and you're doing all of these things in search of a little bit here, a little bit there. Leave the 202 in it, leave the bigger stem on it, call it a day. Use an undercut valve, use the lightest undercut valve that you can get. If you were really, really worried about it, you'd be putting titanium valves in anyways. And this isn't that kind of build. This build is intended to show what you can do in your garage. Now I realize I have a different level of knowledge about some of this stuff than some of you who are watching my videos. But that's part of the reason I'm showing you this, and that's one of the reasons I always tell you, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, because I'll answer the questions. I don't have anything to lose by answering your question, okay? If you want to know something, ask me, and I'll tell you why I do it. I'll tell you why I've raised the roof of the exhaust port clear into the thermactor port, and why I don't care that I got into the thermactor port. It doesn't bother me, okay? Not at all. Doesn't bother me. I'll tell you why I raised the intake ports. I'll tell you why I'm running so much compression. I'll tell you anything you want to know about my engine build. And when this engine build is done and this thing's run, and I'm going to get it on a dyno, and I'll show you guys what kind of power it makes. We'll have flow numbers on the heads. We'll have power numbers from the engine. When you guys get to see this all come together, I hope it leaves an impression on you that the $10,000 to $15,000 crate engines that you can buy from Ford Racing and Dart and different sources out there, these super high dollar crate engines, they're all fine and dandy. If you're needing a warranty on an engine of this power level, you're probably in the wrong hobby. You should go buy a stock car that has a warranty with that level of power. You know, this is something that you can do yourself. You can have that pride of saying, hey, I did it myself. I got in there and I did stuff. I didn't let my fear of trying hold me back. And that's something that it's really, that's the whole point of everything I'm doing on this channel. And I don't want people to be afraid of trying stuff. With respect to these cylinder heads, the only thing I'm not doing in my garage is the valve job and replacing the guides and flowing them. But I'll be assembling them, I'll be setting up the installed height, I'll be dealing with all of that. And checking the spring pressures. I'll know exactly what my spring pressures are at any given lift. It'll be really cool. And I'm going to share all of that setup information with you guys. But for right now, we're starting with a stock head, moving into a modified head, and you know, it's a lot of work, a lot of time with a grinder. In fact, I just bought a new foot pedal to control the speed on my electric grinder, so I don't have to sit and listen to the air compressor running, so that I can run my pneumatics, because it gets old with earbuds in. It's still loud. Anyhow, I thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you soon in the next video. If you like this content, hit the thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, now's a great time to subscribe. And you know, again, one more time, if you got questions, leave them in the comments below. I will answer your questions, and don't be afraid. There's no stupid questions. There's no bad questions. Don't be afraid to ask them. Some of the stuff that's going on right now on these cylinder heads, there's going to be guys out there that won't like it. There's going to be guys with an opinion on it, and they're going to post on forums, hey, look what this idiot's doing with this cylinder head. Okay, that's fine. What have they done? Do they have a grinder? Okay. And when they're done and you see the flow numbers on them and the air velocities and you know how the air moves through the port, and I can show you guys exactly where we land with these things, I think everybody's going to get a much better feel for the direction I'm taking my engine. And that's pretty much what I want to share. So anyways, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.